All right, we've got a tight schedule today, so I will get going and people can keep on trickling on in. But welcome everyone to today's panel discussion. We're here today to talk about applying systems thinking for achieving transformational change in conservation. My name's Jessica Leck, and I'm going to be facilitating this conversation today. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you today from Warramai country in Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people of this land, pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also really like to acknowledge the First Nations communities from all around the world who have been leading in environmental stewardship for thousands of years. We would really love to know where you are all joining us from today, so feel free to jump into the chat and let us know where you're joining from. So tonight's event has been organised by OceanEarth Foundation, where our mission is to build resilient communities and reverse nature loss by unlocking transformational change. We use systems thinking to scale programs and create lasting impact. Our signature programs include GhostNets Australia, which is my baby, working with communities across the Coral Triangle to remove ghost nets and stop this plastic source at its source. Ocean Youth works to empower young people across Australia and New Zealand to take action for our blue planet. And through our fee-for-service arm, Tierra Mar, we collaborate with governments, not-for-profits, communities, and industry to embed systems thinking in conservation and natural resource management. Our goal here is to help shift the sector beyond short-term fixes towards lasting transformational change for both communities and nature. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to our amazing panelists. So joining us tonight is Blair Palisi, who is the Director of Philanthropy for Ethinvest, founder of the Climate Capital Forum, and Managing Director of Climate and Capital Media. Previously, she founded 350.org Australia and was Director for 10 years and Director of Communications for Greenpeace International and Greenpeace USA. Fern Wixon is committed to the international flourishing of nature in all her forms and works to facilitate inner and outer sustainability transformations through leadership, governance, and education. She's been an activist, an academic, and an advisor to government, but is currently employed as a professor of ocean leadership at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway. She's the coordinating lead author for Chapter 1 of the IPBES Transformative Change Assessment, which was recently approved by the almost 150 governments of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Paul Chatterton is the lead and founder of the Landscapes Finance Lab, a global platform dedicated to incubating and financing sustainable landscapes. Launched in 2021 as a spin-off of WWF, the lab pioneers innovative solutions to address complex landscape challenges. Paul has supported initiatives, including two of the world's largest forest carbon programs, Europe's longest river protected area, the largest rainforest reserve in the Pacific, and large-scale financing platforms for peatland and restoration in the UK and Ireland. And finally, our very own Anissa Lawrence is the Managing Director and founder of OceanEarth Foundation, which focuses on building resilient communities and reversing nature loss by unlocking transformational change. With a background in the corporate world and coastal marine fisheries conservation across Asia Pacific, she works to enable innovative approaches and dynamic collaborations, foster future change makers, and drive community-led actions focused on impact and scaling. So before we launch into discussion, just a little bit of housekeeping. We will be recording tonight's webinar for those who couldn't make it tonight, so it's just good for you to be aware of that. And also, during our discussion, if you have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A section, which is a separate section to the chat. If you haven't joined in a webinar on Zoom before, it's just a little bit further along the bar along the bottom. If you can pop your questions in there, we'll use those to kick off our Q&A session at the end of the discussion. And you also have the ability to upvote other attendees' questions if they're along the same thinking of yours. So A few years ago, I found myself experiencing a bit of a burnout after a career of these kind of piecemeal projects. It felt like the effort that we were putting in wasn't matching the progress that we were making collectively. And that is what led me to exploring these different approaches to tackling these issues, and ultimately what led me to OceanEarth Foundation. So, transformational change is a term we hear a lot, but what does it actually mean? That's what we're here to discuss. And I'd like to start by asking each of you, how do you define transformational change in your work? And why do you think it's necessary rather than just making those small improvements? I'll start with you, Anissa.
Thanks, Jess. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being able to attend our webinar tonight. So for me, transformational change is about having change that lasts and that makes impact at the right scale. And I think for us, we've worked in this space for a long, long time and I in particular in numerous roles, and a couple of us were getting quite frustrated in the conservation world that we were looking at all these other projects happening and nothing was happening at the scale or speed needed to address the significance of the issue. And so that's where OceanEarth was born, as a way to try and help create this paradigm shift in thinking and how action on the ground is delivered. And so we looked at, we use systems thinking in what we do. Particularly for me, my whole world revolves around understanding all the bits and pieces of how particular issues happen. And so that systems thinking, or that systems lens, is really something I think that's quite important from a transformational change point of view. If we're trying to define what it means, we need to understand the system and what all the bits of that to know how do you change the system to get to where you're wanting to go. So, from an OceanEarth point of view, we support projects that have the ability to scale. And when I talk about scale, you often hear about scaling up, scaling out, scaling deep. Scaling out is where you just duplicate what you're doing, in many places. Scaling up is where you can work on the policy and the enabling environment and so on to actually drive create the situation to allow a lasting change to happen. And the scaling deep is about hearts and minds and changing community thinking and values and all that sort of stuff. And so for me, when we work in transformational change, it's about identifying those projects that have that potential, and then working to support them through the work that we do, as well as helping others through the TRMR side, the consulting side of us, to help others use that systems lens to be able to deliver. So I think that's probably, I guess the other thing I would say is it's a transformational change is about bringing different people to the table. If we're trying to do transformational change in conservation, it's not about just getting all the environment people together to say how we're going to solve overfishing. It's about getting all the players in a supply chain, the whole system, at a table and looking at how do you make that change to happen.
Fantastic. Thank you. Blair?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I've worked in lots of different orgs. I suppose many of us have. And now my role is philanthropy. So I guess across all of those, it's a real pull back to where you think the biggest issues are, which is, I guess, your first point of a systems change thinking. So in some ways, you might want to change something specific, but pull back and find what the issue is that allows you to look at that. And other times you'll look at the problem and work up from there. Both can be very effective. In my Greenpeace International days, we would literally every year throw everything up on a big board and decide what we thought were the biggest threats, and then work out, back from there. We divided on the kind of issue areas we worked on, what money would go where, and what was the strategy for each. But everyone really did have to kind of pitch, this is my thing, and I think this is why. And, it was good because it really made you sort of have to focus in on making your case for why this thing is going to work as that transformational change issue. More recently, I worked on the Antarctic Ocean Alliance delivery of the Ross Sea, the biggest marine protected area in the world. through about 4 or 5 years with a very unusual model, which was one ex-Greenpeace campaigner who just plucked people he knew in countries that were key to change the policy. Russia, China, the difficult countries involved in the CAMLR process, the Southern Ocean Management Body that works out of Hobart. So although it operated out of Australia, the campaigners he chose were in, very far-flung places. And so it's really quite fun to bring everybody together once a year and lobby the different countries in their way, and then run the campaign around that. Ultimately successful, but very frustrating and difficult along the way. Run on a very tight budget, so very effective that way. And ultimately we got it across the line. Their hope was to get 3 across, and only the 1 came through. So, it's an example of throwing everything at it and see how far you can get it. And then the last thing I'd just say is I founded 350.org here in Australia, and we ran a divestment campaign. I just bring it as an example, maybe of kind of the perfect stream back. Big problem, fossil fuels and climate. What do you do about it? People don't know what they can personally do. Idea, apartheid, divestment. Look like an interesting kind of comparison of something where people could choose to do something specifically very ethically focused in that case. So Hearts and Minds very focused on churches, universities to say, we're not going to buy from South Africa. And it started a bit of a chain reaction, but it was very ethically based. Whereas the fossil fuel approach to it very quickly, surprisingly became about money. So much to our amazement and surprise, we started with people cutting up their credit cards and moving out of banks, moving out of retirement funds, and giving them a process. Tell them you're going to leave if they don't change their involvement in fossil fuel funding. Then tell them again, and then threaten to do it, and then do it. We had people literally turn up in front of banks and cut up their credit cards in front of media cameras. Banks hated it, but it was a classic example of got down into kind of the granularity of hitting on a particular sore spot. In this case, people with money and brands with money. So banks, super funds in our case in Australia. And then although we started with churches and universities, it very quickly became not only lots of individual people, but big institutional investors. So it's just, for me, an example of kind of tried something and wow, did it work. At the end, I think now it's well over 40 trillion that's been moved out of fossil fuels. And when the Financial Times ran a headline that said coal is dead, we knew that campaign had really helped really focus people's attention on coal in particular initially, now moving well into gas. So those are just a few examples that I've worked on, and each one involved that kind of systems thinking about problem, how could you go at it, trying to look at the opportunities that you could really effectively use campaign-wise, and then seeing if they could work. And I must say, last thing, many of these things we've tried didn't work. So these are 3 that have worked. We'll all say, right, we've tried some things, look like the best fantastic opportunity on paper, and for whatever reason, it just didn't work. So there's a lesson certainly in being open to fail, because you learn every time and you move on and try something else.
Thank you. That's great. Fern.
Yeah, hi. Let me start by grounding myself in gratitude. Gratitude for the organizers for putting this event together. Gratitude to everyone who has showed up and cares enough to spend your time here with us talking about these things. And gratitude, of course, to our Mother Earth, who supports all of us in all the work that we do. So my perspective on transformative change comes from this work I did over the last 3 years with this organization that we call IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. People like to think of it as the IPCC, the big international organization gathering all our knowledge, but for biodiversity loss instead of for climate as a crisis. So it has 150 member governments, and they commission reports, and hundreds of authors from all around the world come together to say, what's the state of knowledge on these different topics that the governments ask for? So the one I worked on was transformative change. They call it transformative, you guys calling it transformational. It's same. So the government said, everyone is talking about the need for transformative change. We have a polycrisis, basically, a climate, biodiversity, pollution, social inequity, all merging together and creating a massive sustainability crisis that is not shifting with our current actions. It's not moving. We are not bending the curves. We're not making significant difference on any of those crises. So people keep talking about, transformative change. That's what we need, deep, transformational change. So the governments of IPBES said, what is it? What do we mean by it? So I spent 3 years reviewing 7,000 pieces of literature, talking to Indigenous communities all around the world, and working with 100 authors from all the regions of the world. And I want to share with you how that report, which got released in December in its summary form, the chapters are coming in a month or so, what it says transformative change is based on that massive review and a massive integration of knowledge from different natural sciences, social sciences, and Indigenous and local communities. First of all, we say that transformative change is indeed the type of systems change that both Blair and Anissa highlighted. And we talk about it as it's change that has breadth. So it's social change that has breadth. And by breadth, we mean it attacks 3 different dimensions. Those dimensions are, it works to shift views, it works to shift structures, and it works to shift practices. So what we mean by that is views is the ways we see the world, the way we think about the world, the way we build knowledge about the world. That is one big body or one dimension that has to shift to get to the root of our polycrisis. The other is structures. That's our ways of organizing, of governing, of regulating. They also need to shift. And of course, our practices, how we behave, how we relate to one another, what we do in the world also needs to change. And the report recognizes that those 3 things, views, structures, and practices, they influence each other. And so if you're only trying to change views, sometimes your work can be blocked by structures or inhibited by practices, and vice versa too. If you're trying to change structures, but you haven't got views with you, you're not going to get the breadth of change. You're not going to get deep, radical social change unless all those 3 are working together and orienting together. And of course, you can cascade across them. They don't only block each other, you can also shift. If you shift views, that can lead to structure, but you have to understand those 3 dimensions of change, and you have to work with them in an integrated manner if you want deep transformative change. So what's the deep then? That's the breadth, but we also talk about the depth of change. And this is because we recognize that transformative change across those 3 dimensions happens a lot, and it's actually happening right now. We are in a moment of transformative change. Views, structures, and practices are changing quite radically in the current geopolitical climate, but not in a direction that we necessarily want. So we talked in our report, and we focused in our report on deliberate transformative change for the goal of a just and sustainable future. Because you can have transformative change in many directions that is not the directions of a just and sustainable future. So we said, if you want a just and sustainable future with deliberate transformative change, the depth of the change has to get to what we call the underlying causes of our polycrisis, underlying causes of biodiversity loss, climate change, pollution, social inequity. And what are they? They were identified as, number 1, disconnection from and domination over people and nature. That disconnection and domination pattern in our social and cultural milieu is a root cause of all of these crises. And unless we get to the depth of transforming our sense of disconnection and domination, we're not going to get to a just and sustainable world. The second underlying cause identified in the report is the concentration of power and wealth. And oh man, do we see that driving all kinds of trouble right now. The third one was the prioritization of short-term, individual, and material gains. So that prioritization is a root cause of all these crises. So we talk about the breadth of change, the depth of change, get down into those root causes, and that you make a deliberate effort to it. And for us, that's the transformative bit, when you're doing the breadth and the depth in a systems manner. And I can say a million more things, but I'll pause there and I'll keep talking in the next rounds. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Fern. Paul, we'll throw to you.
I'll unmute myself first. Hello, everyone. Very good to meet you all. And thank you, Anissa, Jessica, for this invitation. Wow, I must admit I'd never come across your work, Fern, and it sounds fabulous, and so relevant to what we're doing as well. So I lead the Landscape Finance Lab. We span out of WWF 3 years ago. It's a small organization, and we span out very much out of grief. I've spent my life working to protect nature and failing again and again. And, what are we doing wrong here was the question. When we decided to change the game, what we were doing wrong is that we're working at the scale of projects. Nature works at the scale of 1 million hectares and above. Well, my hobby is tropical plant ecology, and the more you learn about tropical plants, the more you see how incredibly connected they are. But when you think about working on nature, you've got to think about connectivity, you've got to think about pollination systems, you've got to think about water flows, you've got to think about migration. It doesn't mean you have to act at that scale of 1 million hectares. Your contribution can add to other contributions, but you've got to start thinking at that scale. And honestly, who's doing that? And particularly in the commercial world, everyone's thinking in the opposite direction. They're disconnecting. So landscapes, it was our solution. Working at the scale of 1 million hectares, working at the time frame of a generation, and working with finance of not less than $100 million. That was the target that we set ourselves in the Landscape Finance Lab. We're changing the game and producing solutions that can work over that scale, and very much, connecting to the messages that you're talking about, Fern. And as we went along, we found that the big story is justice. That's what changes the game, and I can say more about that later. What's a landscape? I can give you the long definition, but I won't. We wrote a book about it, the Little Sustainable Landscape book. If you want to read that, that'll tell you the story. I'll put it in the chat box. There it is. But the simple story is a landscape is what people see as the landscape. And that might be the ecology. It could be a catchment area or a mountain range or something like that. It could be your community as opposed to other communities, a tribal nation, a culture group. It can be an administration, a district, a province, or more recently, it can be a supply shed. Companies are starting to see themselves as operating out of an area that supplies the goods that they need for their commerce. So they're all ways of doing ways of thinking about landscape. The landscape approach brings people together to solve big problems and to share the resources to achieve that in a way that solves many smaller problems as well. Where we are, as Fern said, we're in a polycrisis. But more than that, where we have a set of tipping points. I highly recommend reading the tipping points report that came out, I think a little over a year ago, Global Tipping Points report, which shows that so many things are about to flip, and it's going to get much worse very rapidly. So how do we address that? We join up our efforts, we think larger, we engineer for dealing with those larger problems, and we start to create positive tipping points, and that's what landscapes are. So let me stop there. But I love your recommendations of connection, sharing the power, thinking long term, Fern, and we love landscapes. They're a way to do that, and they're a lot of fun. They bring people together as well. Back to you, Jessica.
Thanks so much, Paul. I love that you're speaking on a landscape scale. One of the things that led me to go, hang on, what are we doing? Is 10 plus years ago at university, we were told make sure everything has adaptive management built into it, and make sure everything is working at the landscape scale. And after a career of 10 years, I went, we're not doing either of those things in anything. And it just drove me a little bit nutty. So I'm glad there are people out there definitely doing what we're supposed to be doing. Okay, so thank you guys so much for summarizing that. I think we all have a really good handle on the idea now. And for those of us who have had an idea of what transformational change should look like or is the concept for a while, I think we all realize that it can be really, really hard to put into practice. So from your collective experience, I'd really love to talk about where you've seen that transformational change has actually worked. And can you share a success story where systems thinking helped drive a real change in the outcome? I will start with you, Blair.
That's a great question. I've given 3 examples where I think it did work, and there are various scales. So divestment, 40 trillion, not small, systems change, but also it was also about giving people something specific they could do. Always really important. What's the ask of people? If you're running a public campaign on something specific, climate change in this case, and really specifically fossil fuels, kind of taking away the social license of fossil fuels, getting people to understand that coal, oil, and gas are not good. They're bad. Even if you've been told your whole life they're a critical part of the economy. It's what makes our world engine go. It employs millions of people, all the stuff we've been fed. Just changing that narrative to say to people, it's bad, you can divest. You can choose to take your money and remove it from someone who will not change their policy about fossil fuels. Your bank, your retirement fund, where your church's investments are as a group, where your university's endowment is. It became quite an effective way to show people how the system worked. And the whole campaign got to the 40 trillion mark over 6 years, which is relatively quickly for something that, and this is global. So while I ran it in Australia, and we were the 2nd largest country in the world after the US to effectively jump in and use it and start real numbers. The local government was another area where amazingly, local governments are much more progressive than federal governments because they're actually the coalface, if you will, no pun intended, of where people come to them with problems. Like, we have a problem with climate. We have either water inundation or we want to install solar, but we're hitting all these difficulties. So because they're already predisposed to understand the on the ground thing, councils were real leaders in Australia and other places in the world, local governments, cities, towns. And so the 3 I watched most closely were the US, UK, a little bit of Europe, and Australia. New Zealand also undertook. So I know it's not equivalent to the biodiversity question, which I think is harder. And I really think all of you working on biodiversity and my Antarctic Ocean Alliance was easy because it was one very specific thing we went for. But I would say about that there's something to that. We looked at the big picture and thought, can we make a difference? Here's a regulated body. It's relatively small within the UN. It's sort of separate to the UN structure. It's a limited number of countries, and you can influence them. So it was a tactic. The tactic was, let's try going for the Antarctic Ocean Management Body. Let's see if we can take $10 million over 5 years and get the world's biggest marine protected areas up. That's different than trying to solve the poly crisis or the biodiversity crisis. And I would say that my expertise is this stuff. This is like, give me a problem and I'll work on a thing and how to get at it, which doesn't mean I don't work on systems thinking. I'm a particularly good throw the ideas on the ground and work out which ones you think can stick and really cut through on a limited budget with a limited number of people, across whatever countries. That's my strategic specialty. And because I came at it with a communications background, never forgot the comms piece. You could transform and change a problem with one Greenpeace photo. Truthfully, we took down humongous corporations and terrible practices with one action, with one protest, one picture, and making sure it got to the media so they could see it. So there's lots and lots of ways to try, but I'm not suggesting this is going to solve our poly crisis. I am suggesting it's going to take a lot of us thinking about a lot of these strategies and ways, and that the audience we're talking about is everybody, everything at every level, right? So you got to get really creative. But those would be like, I use divestment because it is sort of a good one, and it's able to be understood as a campaign, and it did start out as one thing and then morphed many times, and became a much more successful thing we ever thought would be possible. And while I know we're not winning the climate crisis overall, I would put out to you, and it's maybe, I'm not taking any ginormous credit for this, but we really are close to cracking the climate, the getting off fossils and getting on to clean, where it's hanging in the balance, whether we'll go one way or the other. And what's interesting about that is the reason I am occasionally slightly optimistic, not all the time, only sometimes, is that it now lines up with making economic sense. And you can't say that maybe might not have happened as fast without a divestment campaign. Do you know what I mean? Like, it just sped up the money thinking. And Bill McKibben's article about the 3 numbers, if you didn't read it, go check out a piece he wrote for the Rolling Stone back in like 2010, I think it was, that summed up for people that if you don't understand 3 numbers, one is the carbon budget of the world. If we get past this, it's over. The amount of money already committed to being invested in new fossil fuels, and then ultimately, the Earth's 1.5 degrees, and they do not equate. And he told us this in an amazing article back in, I think it was 2010. And it was the highest read article in Rolling Stone at the time ever. Like, the number one, like, imagine a weird numbers story by a climate buff and, environment buff, and he's a great writer, just really captured people's imagination, because they went, I can see it now. I understand the problem. I said, so many pieces too about this stuff is about communicating it. And sometimes the campaign is the communication, the tool you use to communicate. So that's a little rambling, but I hopefully give you an idea of my skill strategy. Throw me a problem and I can give you something to try in 10 minutes. But you others on the call are thinking about the combination, the complexity, and we need all these things and a lot of creative people to be, throwing this stuff out and trying it so that people can get activated in it and take hope from the wins that we do get.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's a really good testament to one thing I always say is you need as much diversity. It isn't just an ecosystem thing, it's a people thing. And we need those economists and those social scientists all in the room with our ecologists, and we all need to work together. So yeah, it's definitely really important to be thinking about. Thank you, Blair. And Ben.
Yeah, so this issue of what does successful transformative change look like, how do we recognize it in the world, was something we talked about over the whole 3 years. It was one of our major sticky points of the discussion, because on one sense, if we're talking about transformative change for a just and sustainable world, which is what we were talking about, what's the success story? Can I give you a success story? Well, we're not in a just and sustainable world, so are there any success stories? That was a big question. Can we talk about success? What are the examples if we're not in that world? So that spiraled into a whole range of conversations of the scale issue, which has come up already in our conversation. Like, if there's an initiative on the ground, like a divestment initiative, doing amazing work and leading us in that direction, can we talk about that as a successful transformative change, even though it hasn't led to the global transformative change that we need to be in a just and sustainable world? And how do we acknowledge the value of the initiative and also say it's not everything we need? We need more. How do we talk about the wonderful work that's going on in the world, and at the same time not pretend that we don't need radical, more different and expansive kinds of work? So we were just circled, how do we talk about success and transformative change over and over and over and over again? Now, we didn't land on a great answer, obviously. I think it's a rich discussion because there isn't a simple answer to it. But what I will say is what we did talk about was the idea of transformative potential. The idea that you can have wonderful initiatives in the world doing wonderful work, whether they're targeting climate change, biodiversity loss, social inequity, or whatever it is in the sense of the polycrisis. You can have initiatives that you say, you are wonderful. We love what you're doing. You're having incredible effects, and we see you have transformative potential. You have the potential to realize more fantastic things. You have the potential to do more, as we all have. We all have incredible potential as human beings, and we can realize that potential more as we move through our lives. So we like to look at initiatives and say, yes, wonderful, great, and you have transformative potential. You have potential to do more. So what's the more? We encourage people to think about stretching their initiatives. And we stretch in the 3 dimensions. So you might have a great initiative that's really targeting structures, really targeting changing laws, changing regulations, changing the way we govern. Say, yes, that's fantastic. Can you stretch yourself to work more on views and practices? Or vice versa. Maybe you got someone who's really targeting practices. We say, yes, can you stretch yourself up to structures? Can you stretch yourself into views? And that kind of stretching is this growing into and realizing the full transformative potential of your initiative. We also talk about the stretching in the sense of we have 4 principles of transformative change we talk about in our report. And they're kind of counter principles that are necessary for us to anchor in if we're really going to target the underlying causes that I highlighted: domination, concentration of power and wealth, and this kind of prioritization of the short-term individual and material. So we say the principles that came up over and over again as necessary for this kind of transformative change that gets at those underlying causes. Just like Paul said, equity and justice, number 1. If you're not grounded in a concern for equity and justice, we're not going to get there. Equity and justice, pluralism and inclusion was the second one. Respectful and reciprocal human nature relationships, and adaptive learning in action, because we're working in complex systems. So these were the 4 principles. So we're saying initiatives, stretch in the dimensions of views, practices, and structures, and stretch. Maybe you've got an initiative that's really focused on equity and justice. Can you move into respectful and reciprocal human nature relations? Can you do more on adaptive learning? And trying to have all these small initiatives around the world that are wonderful, stretch and grow their transformative potential. So we talk in those kind of ways about success and encouraging people to do more. And we also talk about transformative change ultimately as a mosaic. Ultimately, as lots of actors at lots of scales and lots of levels doing their initiatives and stretching out into those potentials. And just one case study, because I know people always want concrete examples. One great concrete example, conservation oriented, that I met the co-founder of and was so inspired by is the Lion Guardians initiative. I don't know if people have heard of this. Started in Kenya, very small, with the idea of we're losing lions because the pastoralists, also the indigenous people who are livestock herders, are killing lions because the lions are killing the livestock. So this battle, which we know from many species in many parts of the world, that we're losing species, particularly these apex predators. The Lion Guardians initiative took that warrior instinct and that warrior narrative and that warrior view and culture and went from killing lions to a warrior of protection and guardianship. And the focus is on coexistence of communities and lions together. And so they built this program of turning the Maasai warriors into guardians of lions and guardians of communities. So communities call the lion guardians when there are problems with a lion. The guardians come in and they talk to the community about what's going on, but they also get to know the lion. They find out who is the lion doing the attacking, what's its need. Is it a mother who's hungry? Is it a problem adolescent? They give the lion a name. They get to know, have a respectful and reciprocal relationship with the lion. They work on protecting the communities, building stronger surroundings, the kind of traditional fences of the communities. They work on monitoring. They stand up all night watching so the community can relax and sleep. They find out more about the lion. They move the lion away. They have all these practices that are about protecting the community and protecting the lion through this kind of commitment to coexistence. And this model has now been scalable and grown. It's now in multiple countries. It covers over 1 million acres of land because they're saying it's not, there are context-specific ways of doing this, but there's also a model that can spread and that can move into other areas. And they're now running training programs and expanding their initiative. So it's a really beautiful, inspirational example, but one that can also probably stretch its transformative potential through looking at our dimensions and principles. Thanks
so much, Fern. I love the Lion Guardian example. Whenever I'm on my soapbox about protecting dingoes, I always refer back to it as a different method to managing predators in a landscape.
Mm.
Paul, so I'll throw to you.
Yeah, a lot comes out of grief, and we're seeing remarkable success. And Nissa knows this. We worked together on some reef programs in Fiji many years ago when we started the Landscape Finance Lab, and it's so exciting to see what's happened there. I think the lesson is that anyone can drive forward a landscape, can drive forward transformational change, and we're seeing evidence of that again and again. You can do it, but connect. Don't do it on your own. Don't think big. Go from projects to an entire landscape. Think long term and how to make it last. Focus on a bigger problem than, as you were saying, Fern, focus on a bigger problem than you think you can solve, because then you all have to find the solution, and inevitably you do. It's remarkable what we've found as we've worked with communities around the world, and think about the money. How do you get the big money? And I must admit, I'm a little sick of writing proposals all the time. How do you create a return? So by producing the solution, you automatically get paid, which we're not quite there yet but we're seeing evidence that that's possible. And all of that is much more interesting than just doing a project, but it requires a shift in thinking. How to do that? Well, look at the book that I've shared. The Little Sustainable Landscape book has the 5 elements for landscape restoration. It's very simple. It's just the project approach, but you bring together the stakeholders in the landscape to design a solution. Who needs to be in the room? What's the problem and the possible solution? What's the vision? We all agree together, and an action plan. Get the money, make it happen, and monitor and learn. It's pretty simple. Where are we seeing this working? Well, we've got a report coming out shortly called Investing in Critical Systems. We've reflected on where you need to put the effort, and really there's 4 places where we need to focus on critically. Rainforests, reefs, and wetland systems, particularly peatlands. Those 3 contain most of the biodiversity on the planet, most of the fresh water, and most of the natural carbon. So, unless we're working on those, we're failing. We can work everywhere else, of course. And then the 4th one is agricultural systems, because they're on grasslands, which are critical parts of biodiversity. They produce our food, but most importantly, they're destroying the other 3. So that agriculture has to shift. So those 4 things. So as I said, we helped a local team in Fiji, Anissa and I, to create what's called Matanataki, a platform for investment into businesses that are helping to protect the reef, and all sorts of fabulous things. The first thing they did was buy a couple of waste dumps that were poisoning the reefs and destroying mangroves, and turn them into recycling centres. And that's still going on. It's really exciting to see what happened out of that, and how much the private sector, how rapidly the private sector can move. Taught us a lot. Our second experiment was in Sumatra, the rainforest of Sumatra. The tire company Michelin was sourcing their rubber from an area right next to the jungle, to a thin ribbon of jungle across the center of Sumatra. We brought together with Michelin and WWF a whole set of players, and what came out of it was a thing called the Tropical Landscapes Finance Facility. That ended up being a $95 million sustainability bond that's transformed the rubber production in that area to be wildlife friendly, to protect the rainforests, to work with communities. There's been a few criticisms of it, but I'm not sure that they're all fair. The jungle would have been destroyed had we not gone forward with that. But it showed again that the power of commercial money to transform a landscape is really large. Forest carbon, I helped design two of the world's largest forest carbon programs, one in the Democratic Republic of Congo and another in Borneo. They show that it's possible with carbon investment to secure forests and give people a good income. They're a bit crazy, I must admit, but we learned from those how to do large-scale investments with performance finance, and that's a really rapidly growing area. We took that to the wetlands of Scotland and Ireland, of all places, that methodology, and we've had great fun in northeast Scotland. There's a place called the Flow Country that very few people have gone to. It's probably the wildest part of the UK mainland, and we were asked to help a team of 35 organisations who were already very organised to restore the peatlands up there. This one area, it's 400,000 hectares, contains more carbon than all of the forests of the United Kingdom combined, and it's degrading. And peatlands are the massive carbon bomb. If they dry out and start to burn, we've seen already in Indonesia what happens. The solution was fantastic. Over about 3 years, that team on the ground with some support have now created a financing instrument to restore 170,000 hectares of peatlands. It was launched exactly a year ago, and the first farms are now being restored. They finished one farm already. And what I'm most excited about there is that they have a principle of supporting the smallest players first. Carbon investment makes the rich richer. And that's what was happening in Scotland. Only the rich people can afford to kick off a carbon project, and they get all the money. And various carbon companies in London and Zurich. How to flip that around, what they did was create their own carbon company that can work for the farmers and for the crofters, who are the indigenous people of that part of the world, as well as for the lords and the oligarchs and the rich people. The rich people can look after themselves, but the community was getting very angry at the rich people who were benefiting from this carbon. Just last Friday, we helped the government of Ireland launch a triple payment system for carbon, water and biodiversity payments, the first in the world, I think. Super proud of that. So there's lots going on in the wetland space as well now, and those lessons are being transferred to other parts of Europe, and I hope to the tropics where the most important peatlands are. But simple lesson is that these can start from anywhere. It might be an entrepreneur, it might be a government, an NGO, a local government. People are really critical, but just get together and connect and start thinking big. It's possible.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Paul. Anissa, throw to you.
Yeah, so I'll keep it short, Jess, because I'm just conscious of the time. So I guess as an example for me, I said at the beginning, we look at where there are projects that have that transformational potential, similar to what Fern was talking about, and then we bring them into our fold and try and help them scale, whether that's up, out, or deep. It's just a different way of saying it, how Fern was talking about it before. And one of those is GhostNets Australia. And there's a 20-year history of GhostNets Australia, and I won't bore everybody with every single detail, but it started out, we are a global hotspot for abandoned, lost and discarded fishing gear washing up on beaches in the remote part of Northern Australia where hardly anybody lives. It's Indigenous land managed by Indigenous communities and the ranger groups. And 20 years ago, we started looking at, why is this happening? Like, why is all this gear washing up? And it kills thousands of turtles every year, massive impact on the health of the communities up there and their connection to country and so on. And so we spent a long time trying to understand that system and what is the system's thinking behind why all these nets keep washing up in Northern Australia. And there was all sorts of modelling and science and bringing together all those different players around a table to try and understand what is going on up there and why in particular. And so there's been the transformational journey for Ghost Nets Australia has been a long journey of discovery to get enough information where we can say, we understand the system now, we know why this is happening, we know what's causing it, we know how to stop it at the source. And so we now need to work out how do we do that. And so as part of that process, transformation is a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. When you're trying to do something at a landscape scale, and for us, what we learned is that it actually comes from East Indonesia and beyond. East Indonesia has thousands of little islands, 1.6 million people. It is the most poor part of Indonesia in terms of poverty index. No electricity, many issues, right? Lots of illegal fishing, huge complex systems. So we got to the point though where we understood that system enough to know how do we turn off that tap. And so what we did was we then trialed something first at a very small scale to see if it worked, to see if there was a way to actually address the issue in a sort of controlled setting at the moment, still thinking about scaling up in terms of the enabling environment and the structures and the policy and governance and so on, and the deep side in particular about the values and hearts and mindsets. And so it was called CNET Indonesia as a trial, and it was based on a model we used in Australia, working with the fishing industry here. And here it was about trying to reduce the impacts on protected species. In Indonesia, we flipped it on its head. So using that approach that Paul was talking about that they apply for the Landscape Finance Lab, we did something very similar. And it started with, rather than us just saying, right, we need to stop these ghost nets, we need a fishing gear collection system that'll solve our problem, we actually went to these communities and spent a lot of time listening to them, asking them, what are your issues, what are your priorities, not asking them, why do we have all these ghost nets? Ghost nets didn't come into it until the very end. It was about trying to understand the situation on the ground, what was happening, why these issues were occurring, but all in the context of how they live, and we've got food security issues up there. You've got illegal fishing, stealing all the fish, or we did at the time. Communities didn't have any jobs. There's no electricity in most of them, most of the villages. Many can't put their kids through school. It goes on and on and on around this poverty environment trap that they're in. And so we trialed a project where we went, okay, let's focus on addressing the priorities of these communities, and we just picked a couple in different locations. And it was funded by Australian government, and they were gracious enough to let us try something a bit left field, not your usual stock standard conservation project. And so it was basically a poverty alleviation project that got conservation outcomes. And it happened before COVID, so it was sort of in the mid 2000s where we trialed this. And we were not sure if it was going to work because, we're not poverty alleviation specialists. We work in conservation, but we brought the right people to the table that could help us sit with the communities to design the project in what needed to happen. And so we didn't just design it ourselves. The communities actually participated. So, everybody's talking about co-design these days. Well, it was very much this co-design process. And it was remarkable seeing, the transformational journey that these communities went through where, we were doing things like helping them add value to seafood and create markets and many other things in addition to dealing with the ghost net issue. But it taught us a lot, and And it showed us that you can transform the lives of communities through doing things when you listen to them, rather than just going in and saying, we need to put a protected area here, let's do this, and then we'll replicate it. And I actually learned a couple of months ago, the communities are still doing what we started, even though the project finished a long time ago. And that was because this scaling up part was, we brought the government along, like the district and provincial governments, they were brought along the whole way. So it wasn't just a case of we did this and then we told the government and this is what's done. They were working side by side with us, and it wasn't just fisheries people and environment, it was a whole of government approach. Transport departments, health, food, you name it, infrastructure, the whole lot was involved in this project. And some huge successes came out of it, and a lot of lessons for how do we turn off the tap of ghost nets and marine litter and so on into Northern Australia. And so we're now at the stage where we've trialed it, we've learned a lot, and so we know how you do the scale up and out now, scale up and deep. Now we're working on the scaling out and how you replicate that across 1.6 million people. And so it's a journey, and we're just at the start of that journey of the replication process. And we have an amazing group of partners that are working with us on that, because we're not experts in everything. We need the right people at the table, and it will be working with the communities and the governments to do that. But I guess, so that's my example. We're still on the journey. I can't say that we've solved the ghost net problem, but we will solve the ghost net problem for Northern Australia. If it's the last thing we ever do, we're going to solve it. But we know how to do it now. And so I think, that process, it took a while to understand. And I think that's what's been really important, understanding that system and every little aspect of that, to know what are those barriers and drivers and who has to be involved and how do we change things, and using the communities to tell us in particular what needs to happen, I think, rather than just going to the usual suspects, is a really core part of that. So I guess that's my example, Jess.
Thanks, Anissa. And yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. When I heard that those communities were still doing things that were carried out in like 2018, that's, to me, is the sign that something has been truly transformational. When it continues after the project life and the project funding and the project manager has left the scene, when it continues past, that to me is a sign of success. So just keeping an eye on time, I'm going to kind of blend our next two questions into a final question for everyone. And so we've all kind of touched on some of the barriers and the challenges, and I think day to day in our lives, the attendees will know the challenges of trying to apply this kind of thing to our projects and our work. So I guess what I'd really love to know is, in your experience, can I ask you to give one piece of advice for overcoming those really common challenges to applying transformational change or thinking to our work? A piece of advice on how you can apply this kind of thinking in your work, whether you're working at the policy level or the project management level. I'll start with you, Blair.
I'll be quick and say funding is a real challenge. It's hard to get people to fund over a long enough period of time to get to the transformational change. So how to overcome it, try to find those funding partners who get it. And it's hard, but don't give up looking. Even if you get a funder in who's only going to go a year or get you started, keep your kind of view wide as to what you're financing. Either it's a giver, it could be a foundation or a individual high donor. There are people out there who really get this stuff, so keep searching for it. I think that's don't give up and say, well, we've only got funding till X, and then that's it. We leave the ghost nets behind, and that's the end of it. Keep plugging away, and partner if you have to. Partner with some unusual people, whether it's a business or a government agency. Try it. They often do get transformational change potentially longer than some foundation people who want impact and they want it fast, and it's just not realistic about how hard it is and how long it takes to get stuff done. So don't give up finding your good partners that understand what you're trying to do.
Definitely. Thank you. Fern.
Yeah, I might riff off what Blair said about don't underestimate how hard it is or how long it is takes to get it done. I mean, some of the challenges we can clearly understand are the deep roots of what we're trying to dig into, right? Like this pattern of disconnection from nature and domination of both nature and people, you know, it's got deep roots in the colonial era that's perpetuating still, you know. So the fact that we have these patterns of colonialism still with us, that's the kind of thing we got to uproot. And you're not going to, that unfolded over hundreds and hundreds of years. So don't think that we're going to radically shift. And I think it's hard to do that, right? It's very hard to hold, it's kind of, there's a tyranny of urgency in our polycrisis, this sense of it's so urgent, it's so urgent, it's so urgent. And it is, but I have to hold the sense of urgency, the importance of acting immediately, the need for change now, with the idea that change is hard and not going to happen overnight. And I have to commit to actions that actually I may not see the full benefits of in my own lifetime. I have to commit to things and change in the service of the greater thing that I am part of, whether that's nature for you or the divine or whatever it is. If I don't commit to the idea that this isn't about me seeing the outcomes necessarily in my lifetime, because the deep transformative social change that I'm talking about for a just and sustainable world, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a long struggle, but that doesn't diminish the importance of me doing the work that I'm doing. It's laying the work that we do, all of us today, is laying the foundations of the big, glorious cathedral that will be the just and sustainable world. Now, this metaphor comes to me from an experience I had when I went and saw the cathedral in Cologne. I don't know if anyone's seen this incredible Gothic cathedral in Cologne. And the tour guide told me that the cathedral took 600 years to build. I was like, are you insane that someone started laying bricks at the base of that cathedral, knowing that they wouldn't see the finished product, their children wouldn't see the finished product, their children's children may not even see the finished product, and yet that person's out there laying the bricks, you know. And that was so inspirational for me. And of course it was in the service of something greater, in the service of whatever that was for that person. But I feel like we need to reconnect with that idea. We need to reconnect with the idea of laying the brick, those small initiatives, my daily steps, my daily actions, my daily interactions, the way I interact with people in my life. They matter. They're important. They're the bricks at the foundation of the cathedral. Now, I also have to do that work, recognize the urgency of the work, at the same time that I hold the idea that it's a long road. It's a multi-generational initiative, and it's in the service of the greater. And the greater for me is flourishing life on Earth. Yeah, so my advice is, that's hard to do, of course, but to hold those two things, hold the urgency and the long distance, hold the small and the great, and move forward with that. And I definitely believe in what Blair was saying too, the power of coalitions of different kinds of actors. That our report highlighted that also as a really key tip, the power of coalitions across actor types. Yeah, thanks, Jess.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that not only can we benefit from appreciating that mentality of connecting with something that you might not see, but if we can increase that understanding within our sector, maybe we can start to transform the funders' minds and have those longer term funding schedules and commitments as well. If collectively we can start to have that appreciation. So thank you so much. I'll throw to you, Paul.
Well, I love that metaphor of the cathedrals, and you know, that's what we have to build, the cathedrals of the future that repair nature, that rebuild our communities, and give us all hope, that return the spirit. And you know, the good news and the scary news is that there's a massive amount of money coming down the line. And Blair, I'm with you. I don't know how it all fits together because a lot of people have got a lot of money, but they're just not connecting up. And that's what we've got to do is connect them up and get them all thinking about how they can invest in the little bits of building the cathedral. You know, who's going to do the bricks? Who's going to get the scaffold? Who's going to pay for the scaffolding? But thinking about how they're all put together. I was last week at an amazing financial event in Amsterdam, the Global Investment Forum of Mercer, 600 of the world's top financiers. And I came back much more hopeful than I went there. The impact investment is really strong despite what's happening in the US. It's multiplied 7 times in the last 7 years. It's now the size of the GDP of Australia. So it's massive. And you're getting all of these new investment themes, precision farming and drone forestry and regen agriculture and bioacoustics and resilience, you know, you name it, it goes on. It's really exciting. But you leave all of this to the bankers and we're in a mess because they'll just do the usual boring stuff. They'll build a few shopping malls. They won't build the cathedrals. So, but they're keen to do it. They did a quick poll at this conference of who the investors want to invest in. Would it be impact or AI or crypto? Impact came out top. You know, there's and, you know, many of these companies are dropping their climate targets because of what's happening in the US, but they're not dropping their investment into sustainability research. It's as big, the surveys show that it's as big as the money they're putting into AI, which is a lot of money. So, you know, there's a lot of money coming down the line, commercial money coming down the line for the sort of solutions we all want to see. The challenge is that we have to change our own thinking to be able to work with these guys and learn the language of the financiers or find ways that we can come together, philanthropy, commercial finance, business, community, and create the cathedrals. That's our challenge, I think. And yeah, maybe we won't achieve it, but maybe there'll be a few Cologne cathedrals at the end of all of this process.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And yeah, I like what you're saying about if you leave the bankers to it, they'll build some shopping malls. I really think that we need to, often what they want to invest in, like AI or crypto, isn't going to solve this problem. So if we can apply our knowledge to inform their investments, we can really work together. Anissa, I'll throw to you with some advice for trying to drive transformational change.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Jess. I think there's a couple of things. The first thing, and it's been said by, I think, everybody, that we need to acknowledge that transformational change takes time and that we're not going to do it overnight, regardless of how quickly we want to make it happen. It takes time. And in saying that, I guess from a lessons learned from the work we've been doing for so many years, the planning part, that understanding the system, that systems thinking part, the planning is really, really critical, and having a really sound theory of change. I mean, everybody bangs on about a theory of change, but really making sure that your theory of change for how you drive that transformational shift is sound is absolutely key to being able to then, you know, put the different bits of bricks together to create the cathedral down the track. So I think they're probably the first 2 points in terms of advice. And then the final one is that if you know, I guess, you know, where I'm working is very different to the space that Blair works in, the financial world. And, you know, we do work at the landscape level, I guess, to some extent, but again, different to what Paul's doing. But having that community buy-in, we talk about the need for community buy-in and so on all the time in everything we do, but understanding the social ecological stuff that is going on in a community, and how do you know, drive that shift in hearts and minds and values and whatnot to bring that generational change. That's really key, I think, to part of this. in some respects, it's probably harder than trying to create the enabling environment and getting governments and regulators and financiers to come to the table. It's about how do you change people's values, and if you've, been brought up in a Western society, our values are very different to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander. How do you blend that together? How do we learn from each other? And it's about having the right people at the table from the beginning, going through that design process, the planning process, and respecting, everything that's being said, acknowledging, learning, using it, to be able to make sure that that theory of change is sound, and then testing it before you then jump. That, I guess that'd be that's my advice or experience anyway.
Thanks, Anissa. Fern, did I see you have your hand up? Did you have an extra comment? No, accident? Yeah, that's all right. No worries. Okay, so thank you guys so much. That is our formal questions. So now we'll just throw to the Q&A. So I want to remind our attendees online, you're more than welcome to throw your questions into the Q&A. But I think we'll start with one that's come from, sorry, I don't know your name, RKK. And the question is, are human population growth and environmental impact per capita typically considered as physical drivers of the polycrisis? And if so, how does your work target them? So I think I'll start with Fern, because he's using your language of polycrisis.
Oh, RKK, whoever you are, I mean, that is a finger right on something that took a lot of energy in our discussions of the Transformative Change Report as well. We had quite, because we, in IPBES, we go through open review processes, meaning we make a draft, we put it out, anyone can register as a reviewer, and they send comments, and then we do another draft, and so on and so forth. So we in that open review process over the last 3 years, it was like a coalition of coordinated actors who were commenting on this issue of population growth. And to what extent were we addressing population growth? Wasn't that a major issue? Could we please talk more about that, and so on? So we spent a lot of time discussing it. We spent a lot of time analyzing the literature on it to say, yeah, what is the indication, to what extent, and so on. The evidence does not point to population growth being the main driver of environmental crises. It's much more about the level of consumption, this kind of per capita impact, as you might be saying, that kind of, it's the combination, obviously, and what we saw in the global assessment of IPBES is they talk about demographic factors as being indirect drivers of the physical crises that we're seeing. So not necessarily a direct driver, but an indirect driver. When they talk about demographics, they don't just mean the number of people, they mean the distribution of ages and locations, and whether you're an urban population or a rural population, that all of those things can be indirect drivers. But the fact of the numbers, the evidence on that isn't super clear. It is much, much, much clearer on consumption. The levels of consumption are much more specifically direct drivers of the physical impact. And of course, once you combine high levels of consumption with high population. So for us, the indirect, the sort of more underlying issue is that what is driving population growth and what is driving the consumption levels of the populations that we have. This kind of idea that happiness comes from high levels of consumption is far more problematic. But of course, this issue of why do we think it's important to have more and more people? And that differs around regions. We know that. We know that more precarious, more vulnerable populations tend to have more children, but they're not consuming more. So the picture is very complex, but it's something we discussed a lot. But I see Blair's on the move and wants to get in, so I'll make space.
You're very kind. I'm just going to drop off early and sorry to leave, but just want to say educating girls seems to be number one thing instead of population. And when you do that, population drops. So educated women, educated girls, big solution, and doable. But I hate to leave early. It's been such a pleasure. Hope to meet with you all again. All the best.
Thank you so much for joining us, Blair. Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I just add, in addition to what Blair says about educating girls, what we also found in the evidence was access to access to access to contraceptives and access to information. Both of those for women around the world made a massive difference.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Okay, we have another question here, and I might throw this one to Paul to start the discussion. And so Michelle asks, the language of ecosystem services kind of perpetuates the paradigm of valuing nature for its benefits to people. Do you think we need a different paradigm?
Ooh, that's a big one.
Tough question. Yeah.
Certainly, you know, if it's been interpreted as an offset, forget it. That's the wrong pathway. That's just running us into the iceberg. You know, the idea that you can pollute and pay for it later, or that you can destroy nature and pay for putting back some other nature, that just doesn't work. England has just created a biodiversity net gain system that does this, but you know, all of the evidence across the world is that these sort of offset systems don't produce better nature, and they just encourage more destruction. And they're not well managed as well. So what we have to think about is how to transform that system. Valuing nature is really important. There's, you know, the carbon world has started to value carbon. Biodiversity credits could do the same thing. How can we do it in a way that is our gift to nature and that works at the scale of nature? At the moment, biodiversity crediting systems around the world are still thinking at that small scale, the project scale. We've got to be finding a way to invest at the 1 million hectare mark at landscapes, and joining up all of these investments. That's what the Irish government has just done. They've just you know, this payment system for nature, carbon and water. They're encouraging people to get together in landscapes, in catchments and in commonages, you know, in the community, farming communities that they already work together in, and put in joint proposals to restore nature. So can we do more and more of that? But the good news with the commercial finance is that anyone can build a business that repairs nature. You can start it anywhere. All you have to do is find a way to get a return on your funds, and it works particularly well if you do it at large scale. You get, you know, your costs are lower and your returns are better. So get together with the community and find a way to start a business to repair nature and rebuild hope in your community. That is possible. There are examples, and there's a clear process for doing that.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Paul. So we've got a question here from Anonymous, and that's, local governments want to develop strategies that protect biodiversity, but how do you transform wealthy communities that value green spaces as long as they are outside of their properties, but have a beautiful view that actually involves landscape with nature? How do you work with wealthy communities that they do not have the need? So I guess that question is kind of thinking of, how do you reconnect people who think they value nature, but how do you reconnect them on that deeper level where they can actually appreciate the importance of nature, is my interpretation of that question. And I'll start with you, Anissa.
Thanks, Jess, for the hardest question being given. And I was actually going to, just as a follow-on to what Paul said, it was around ecosystem services, and I think it links to this, is that in wealthy communities, you know, like we're in Australia, we have lost our connection to nature. You know, we know that that's a fundamental problem. Fern talked about that at the beginning as one of I think the first point, that we've lost this connection to nature. And I think from a local government point of view, you know, I'm working with my local community here. I was meant to be at a thing tonight about where I live to develop a catchment plan, but you know, that there's a whole range of dynamics where we've got some people love the bay because it's important for the ecosystem, you know, for the ecology and the nature and all the rest of it. Others hate it because there's mangroves, they want them chopped down. Others want to increase the value of their property by dredging the whole thing. You know, there are many values all linking around this issue that we're currently working with as a community where I live. And so I think from a local government point of view, you know, there are quite a few examples now, particularly in the UK, from where I've seen, where there's a lot of work going on to try and get communities connected to nature, whether it's through, you know, planting on the verges and creating pollinator corridors. You know, there's a group in Australia that's doing that as well, or you know, trying to get people more involved in bush care and land care and those sorts of things. You know, I don't necessarily know what the answer is to this question, but I think that that's got something to do with it. I think there's some lessons learned there. But then also, you know, with the Ghost Nets work in Northern Australia, where we're working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island communities, that connection to country that they have, and the understanding that they're part of nature, not dominating it or separated from it, and that when, you know, when the country is sick, they're sick. When the country is healthy, they're healthy. I think there is a lot of knowledge and you know, and understanding that we can gain from learning how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or other Indigenous communities around the world live with that, and while they may not be, you know, as wealthy as, you know, somewhere like Sydney. I think there's lessons to be learned. I don't know what the answer is. You know, I can't answer that question fully, but I think that's the place that I'd be starting to look at what's happening elsewhere that you could pick up from for that.
Yeah, definitely. And I really like what you said about land care. Like, you know, as you know, and some others might know, I spend in my spare time, I still work with some land care communities quite a bit. And one of the things I talk to them the most about is that in my rush to solve all the problems and the urgency, I kind of dismissed for a long time in that space the real value of those land care groups, and I don't know if they actually appreciate it themselves, in that it's more about getting people connected with nature and the social outcomes and the social value that those groups build, rather than the on the ground weed management or those kinds of outcomes. And I think if we can get better at appreciating that, I think those groups and that kind of hands-on engagement with nature does go a long way to getting those people engaged.
I think there's also just one thing I just thought of. I think there's also, you know, the importance for local governments of understanding the socio-ecological context that they're working in, and understanding, you know, the values and what communities, what it's going to take to get communities over the line to want to protect nature, or to, you know, have green space within their housing rather than wanting it all the trees chopped down or so on. So I think that there's more and more work now starting to happen in the socio-ecological space, and I'm working on a project in Port Phillip Bay at the moment that's doing just that, to look at understanding how the community uses Port Phillip Bay, what's important to them, and then combining that with what the science tells us about the issues that are going on from an environmental point of view, and then working with those communities to look at, okay, how do we address your values and deal with these issues together based on that outcome. So I think that seems to be an emerging area, and there's lots to come in that space, I would think, down the track. Sorry, Fern, I took some time up.
No, it's great. I just wanted to say that I think when we talk about human nature connectedness and building kind of reciprocal relationships and respect and care and all of these things that we know we need, I think it's really important that we make the transition out of just talking about the green spaces and the nature that people sort of physically see as nature. Like, I look out my window now, I see a fjord, I see a mountain, that's the nature out there. But to understand that nature isn't this thing only out there in your beautiful green space, in your bay, in your mountainous fjord view, it is the building blocks of your everyday life. You can never escape your interdependence with nature. Every meal that you eat is you taking in nature. You're utterly dependent on nature. Every drop of water that you drink, which you drink multiple times a day, every piece of machinery, the metal that is in this computer, the energy that is fueling our conversation comes from organisms that died many years ago, or in my case, a river that's driving. it's not just out there in the green spaces. Everything I touch, everything in my daily life, all the building blocks of my body and my life are nature, are my interconnections with nature. And when we start to see that, and sort of, if we can then, from that recognition of, oh my God, I am deeply woven into the web. I don't exist without the web. It's not just nice to have a nice view. It's not just nice to have a park. I don't physically exist. And none of the machinery or the chairs or the furniture in my life can be there without nature. And once you start to see that, then if you can also cultivate a sense of gratitude for the fact that you are woven in. There's kind of these steps, I think, that we need to sort of also lean into, so that people start to conceptualize nature in that more interwoven daily experience sense. So that also a teenager living in a high-rise building in downtown Tokyo feels connected to nature because they are, in a very real physical sense. Very different to how we think about nature now, but I think making that connection as well matters for how we move forward with, for example, wealthy communities.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the kind of place where ecosystem services, whilst, you know, some people might have questions about, you know, thinking about is it us using nature, ecosystem services is a very tangible way that people can start to realize how linked they are to nature and how they're interdependent on it. And thank you so much, Fern. See, Anissa, you thought I saved the hardest question for you, but I did not. So the last question I have, I'm going to throw to Paul. I think might, or Fern, or Anissa, we'll crowdsource this answer because it's pretty tough for me. So RKK asked, what tools do you use to model or forecast the impact of changes on an overall system behavior? So I'll throw to Paul first, and we'll go from there.
We don't. The crowd wisdom and the motivation of the people in the landscapes, and I see there's a couple of other questions there about how do I get people to turn up to weed the nature on my headland, and, you know, how do we get people thinking about things? You know, one of the big lessons we learned is not to take solutions to people. The environment world is very good at solving other people's problems, but if they don't want it solved, it's not going to last. And, you know, it's really actually quite destructive, especially if you have money to go and invest in things, because of course people are going to do what you say, even if you tell them to do their thing. That's a big lesson I learned from working in WWF, how to flip that around. And the simple answer is to let people lead, to help them to listen to each other, because there are other people in that landscape, on that headland, who have a problem to solve. It may not be your problem, but when you join together, you can find a common problem that you all want to solve together. And then it's about making it a party, making it fun, you know, and you know, building a cathedral would be a very fun thing to do that lasts for 600 years. You know, what's the cathedral? Weeding the headland may not be the most exciting party, but is there a bigger party that you can have to bring that whole place back, or to bring the community back? And one part of it is the weeding. I don't know, but the communities of hope, I think, are what we're seeing around the world, and they're driven from the people in those communities. So let's listen to them and support them, and it takes time. It's hard work. So don't give up as well. If you're weeding the headland, keep on weeding the headland, and someone else will come and join you, and then suddenly one day you'll find the whole community is there doing it with you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul.
I can come in on that question. I know it's a hard one. It is a hard one. There are lots of system modelers, people who build big, complex computer models to try and predict outcomes from certain decisions. That's not my field. That's not my world, but it does exist. What we emphasize in the IPBES Transformative Change Report is the principle of adaptive learning and action, because in complex systems, you actually can't predict. You cannot predict with any degree of certainty what the full impacts of what you're going to do actually are. So that's why we say you have to be grounded in the principles, and you have to, one of those principles is adaptive learning and action. You have to be alert, monitoring and observing what happens, and be willing to adapt and adjust along the way, because there will be unintended consequences. There'll be things unfolding that you didn't predict and you couldn't predict. So you have to be in that adaptive learning mode all the time. That's the point, rather than prediction. And it was really hard for many governments to say, well, if you can't tell me exactly what the outcome of my action is going to be, why would I do it? I'm not going to do it unless I can know it and control it. And we're saying, actually, for transformative change, they're exactly the things you have to let go of. You have to let go of your illusion of control and your sense that you have to be able to predict before you can act. Our idea is you have to act, you have to watch, and you have to adapt. And that's the only way we get the ability to do good work in complex systems. Has to be like that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay. And in respecting people's time, we will call it there. So I just wanted to say thank you again to our panelists for sharing your insights and your expertise. And thank you to Claire, who had to step out early. And thank you to the attendees for being part of this conversation. Really want to encourage you to continue this conversation beyond this event. Share what you've learned tonight with your colleagues, and maybe think about what this approach might look like in your day-to-day work. And we want to keep this conversation going by offering more of these type of events. So if you have a burning question that you might want us to address in our next webinar, or that might come to you overnight, please keep an eye out for an email, and it'll let you know how you can stay in touch. But other than that, I wish you all a good night, good day to our international guests joining us, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
As well.
Bye.
Ciao.